welcome to COBA's first webinar in a series of conversations that we plan to have with scholars, entrepreneurs, innovators, and other stakeholders to discuss how best to improve the African business ecosystem, as well as share the tools and knowledge needed to make the entrepreneurial journey successful for entrepreneurs. So basically at COBA, we're going to be having this series of conversations, inviting experts such as Ahmed for this first one, who are going to enlighten us more about the African business condition. My name is Martin Tange. I'm a communications consultant at COBA. I write as well as do other things to make money. In this Nairobi, you can't just survive on one hustle, right? The specific focus of today's webinar is going to be about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, with specific focus on what small and medium-sized businesses need to know about it, right? As well as the specifics for general audience. Feel free to leave your questions and comments in the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer them during the question and answer segment. And now to help us talk about this topic is Ahmed Yasin Jelle. I hope I got that right.
Perfect.
Yeah.
It's almost as if you named me.
Ahmed is going to help us understand more about what AfCFTA means, especially for SMEs. He is an international trade and economic lawyer focusing on trade and economic law in the African context. He is currently conducting his PhD research at the University of Bristol on implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and Agreement, as well as its relationship with existing regional economic communities such as EAC, COMESA, and such, and how the development of regional value chains can be used to ensure the success of both frameworks. He is also a teacher of law at the University of Bristol. Yeah?
We're trying. Just trying out here.
That's a pause. I'm taking a pause first before I continue with the rest of the profile. You've done many things in this world, my brother. Prior to the research, Ahmed actually worked as a Kenya qualified advocate with over 7 years experience in complex dispute resolution and advisory services in commercial and international law, just to mention a few areas, of course. In this capacity, he has acted as counsel in several cases before the Court of Appeal and High Court of Kenya, as well as specialized tribunals. He practiced at the firms Kaplan and Stratton Advocates, as well as Anjarwala and Kana, ALN Kenya. He is also a continuing international trade law advisor at the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Young Professionals Network, which is a nonprofit policy and research organization based in Brussels, Belgium. After that lengthy introduction, welcome, Ahmed. It's nice to have you here today. The floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Marty, for the very kind introduction. You've been very kind, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, with the organization, and to speak to your audience, and hopefully have an engaging discussion about today's topic. So thank you so much. Before we can begin addressing some of the questions that will most definitely be raised today, and some which have been raised so far, allow me to lay a foundation for the subject of our discussion today, and Africa's latest hot topic, as you mentioned, Marty, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. For the sake of time, I'll refer to it very briefly as the CFTA throughout our discussion today. And in doing so, let me begin with a bit of a background about what the CFTA is. Launched for trading on the 1st of January 2021, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is an exciting game changer within Africa's and the global trade ecosystem. And currently, Africa accounts for just approximately 2% of global trade, and just under 20% of African exports are intracontinental within the continent of Africa, compared with 59% for Asia and 68% for Europe. Given the numbers, the potential for transformation across our continent using the CFTA as a development tool is therefore significant and clear. It's a much needed platform. The pact will create the largest free trade area in the world, measured by the number of countries participating. Currently, 54 out of 55 African countries have signed the constitutive agreement so far. The only odd one out is Eritrea, and we hope to soon invite the country of Eritrea to sign and ratify the agreement. It connects 1.3 billion people across this considerable market with a combined GDP of approximately $3.4 trillion. And the Development Pact comes at a time when much of the world is turning away from cooperation and free trade to more nationalist and protectionist measures. The CFTA has been the most tangible manifestation of the continent's Pan-Africanist agenda, tracing its roots to the struggle for independence. So it's been a long time coming. And it's important to note that it's one of the flagship development projects of the Africa Union Agenda 2063, which is a 50-year plan to attain inclusive and sustainable development by that year. The CFTA agreement itself aims to boost inter-African trade and investment, as well as promote industrial development by creating a single market that allows for free movement of goods, services, and people, all factors of production. It promises to improve the lives of the African people through inclusive trade policies that ensure that engagement in development of small and medium-sized enterprises, especially, and those especially in the agricultural sector, are realized. Now, while the CFTA was established in 2017, the paperwork creating the agreement itself was signed in 2018. It eventually entered into force in May 2019, which was after 22 states had deposited their articles of ratification. And as at May 2022, and also let's say June 2022, 43 of the 54 signatories, which represents 80% of the membership, have deposited their instruments of ratification. Additionally, and to this point, 88% of the negotiations on product-specific rules of origin have been concluded, covering more than 70% of intra-African trade, according to the CFTA Secretariat. Now, this means that a large majority of tariff line negotiations have already been concluded, ushering in proper trading under the agreement. And recent developments have also shown that the African ministers for trade have come together and agreed to allow the trading of approximately 850 products to commence under the rule of origin protocol of the CFTA. You might wonder why I'm mentioning all these numbers. They're important in an attempt to illustrate the speed with which the CFTA has hit the ground running. Other agreements of this nature in far more developed regions, such as of this nature and also this magnitude, such as the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, the ASEAN, and the EU, as well as Mercosur, a free trade area in North America, have taken significantly longer periods to begin walking. And it's important to note that at this stage, comparing these agreements can be a little misleading, given the differences in our respective continents and regions. The CFTA seeks to operate in the most heterogeneous conglomeration of countries, both economically and sociopolitically. It's simply the most diverse free trade area in the world by quite a margin. Some further statistics, there's more to note, are that according to the African Development Bank, the CFTA plans to enhance intra-African commerce by up to 15%. And according to a World Bank report, a recent World Bank report, removal of non-tariff barriers to trade and improving trade facilitation will result in a 29 to 30% increase in exports by the year 2035, with intra-African exports, exports between African countries growing by what will hopefully be an impressive 81% within that same period. It's clear that with these ambitious projections, if we implement the CFTA properly, there will be a marked improvement in the living standards of African people. These same reports indicate that if implemented properly, the CFTA as a development tool, not just a free trade agreement, has a potential to lift over 100 million people out of poverty. A truly incredible achievement if we get there, and hopefully we will. Now, the CFTA doesn't come into operation in a vacuum. It has come into what is already an established trade ecosystem with a number of regional economic communities. And the question on regional economic communities such as the East African Community, COMESA, ECOWAS, South African Development Community, which are already trading. And the question most people's minds, at least it's been on most researchers' minds, is how does the CFTA interact with these existing regional economic communities, or RECs? And now, being my particular area of research, I've been very keen to find some clarity on this point. The CFTA itself provides some guidance. Article 5, as well as the preamble of the agreement, provide that the existing regional economic communities will act as the building blocks for the implementation of the CFTA, hopefully not the stumbling blocks. And Article 19 of the agreement takes it further by allowing countries that are members of these regional economic communities, which have attained higher levels of regional integration so far, such as the EAC, than under the CFTA, still maintain those levels of higher integration amongst themselves. So countries that have reached a customs union level, such as the East African community, will continue to maintain those levels of integration. It will be encouraged under the CFTA. Now, what this shows is that the CFTA is not here to phase out the existing RECs, not at all. It's here to build on what they have achieved while learning from their mistakes. Now, this is also another notable difference between the CFTA and other globally established free trade agreements. The CFTA has come into a market which is already regionally demarcated with entrenched economic communities. Its implementation is therefore layered. It seeks to ensure a seamless interlinkage between individual countries, which are its primary members, but also the blocks to which these countries are already a part, as well as ensuring a cohesive interaction with third parties, external countries. As you can imagine, this is no mean feat. It's going to be a difficult task. Think of it this way. The regional economic communities that have been there since almost immediately post-independence are the baby boomers of the trade policy world, whereas the CFTA is the Gen Z equivalent, which seeks to improve on things, but also learn from the past. So it's been likened to what is known as the spaghetti bowl crisis. That is what the CFTA seeks to solve, the crisis of an exponential increase of regional trade areas, which has caused this mishmash of trade agreements in the continent and caused a lot of confusion in trade engagement. Now, we've had a spaghetti bowl, the confusing thread of trade agreements. What the CFTA seeks to do is create, again, another analogy, a lasagna plate. So what we'll hopefully have is a CFTA at the top, influencing how these regional economic communities engage with each other going forward, hopefully solving the spaghetti bowl crisis. Now, within all of this, naturally, there's going to be significant challenges, but there will be a silver lining. There are certain opportunities, many opportunities, hopefully many more than the challenges that we will face, that the CFTA will seek to take advantage of. But given that our forum today is fixed for an hour rather than a month, allow me to focus on those that are most relevant to today's subject, SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. As a starting point, it's important to note that the CFTA Secretariat, in its engagement with governments as well as private sector stakeholders, is pushing the Made in Africa agenda so that it can foster development of regional value chains that have a significant role to play in manufacturing products and procuring services that are inherently African. Now, this brings us to our first main challenge, trade financing. And I'm sure a number of the SMEs we have in attendance will identify this as one of their primary challenges. Simply put, SMEs in most parts of the continent lack the financial capability to adequately reap the benefits presented by the CFTA. This has simply not been a priority for financial and lending institutions, but this reality is slowly but surely changing. For instance, I'll give you an example. The Secretariat has entered into a number of memoranda of understanding, which includes with organizations such as the Equity Group in East Africa, Trademark East Africa, and the AfRexim Bank, African Export and Import Bank, to procure financing and support for SMEs. An example is the one I mentioned, the Equity equity MOU. Through its regional private sector economic recovery and resilience stimulus plan, Equity Group intends to support SMEs in East and Central Africa's agriculture, manufacturing and logistics, trade and investment, social and environmental sectors over the next 5 years. And hopefully this will be phased for longer. The package is substantial. We're looking at approximately 678 billion Kenyan shillings, or approximately $6 billion. And so, for instance, if an SME can show that it plays some role, not the entire role, but some role in the production process of a made in Africa commodity, it will have access to those funds. And this hopefully will help them integrate further into the regional value chains and further into the global value chains. Leading us nicely into the second challenge, an underdeveloped regional value chain system. Now, African RVCs, regional value chains, as I'll call them, have suffered stunted or almost non-existent growth. This is largely due to the continent suffering from extractivist policies, where raw materials, as we know, and you export them elsewhere to more developed economies for manufacturing and processing. And then they're sent back to Africa as products we can't recognize anymore. To be sold to our market, because Africa has the largest market in the world. Now, RVCs, however, provide notable advantages, especially for agribusiness SMEs, including reduced transaction costs, which have prompted most multinational companies to outsource manufacturing stages while keeping the most profitable parts of the supply chain in-house. That's what we hope RVCs will develop to in Africa. It also includes specializing in certain activities rather than the complete production process, which means that integration under the CFTA promises to increase labor productivity, knowledge spillovers, and technology transfer across regions. Now, regional value chains will also allow nations and local SMEs, by extension, to leverage their comparative advantage so that you're not doing everything in order to engage in industries from which they would otherwise be excluded. RVCs through the CFTA also support development naturally of economies of scale, because hopefully they will reduce the cost of production while increasing the money that the SMEs will obtain from the finalized product. The third main challenge is the high levels of tariffs for foreign companies. So a company that wants to do business in West Africa from East Africa will suffer, and vice versa, will suffer high taxes. Now, the CFTA, as I mentioned previously, seeks to leverage the gains made by the existing regional economic communities, as well as negotiate new tariff lines, which it has done at notable speed already. Now, what is left for liberalization are those products of particular importance to specific countries, mostly sensitive products that support large parts of a country's GDP. The aim, as we know, is to reduce and ultimately remove most tariffs under the CFTA. With a 90% removal at the very beginning, with 10% to be removed upon further negotiations, for example, in those sensitive products that I've just mentioned. Aside from tariffs, taxes, high taxes, the fourth and most, perhaps the challenge that we feel the most is the lack of infrastructure and networks within the continent. All these gains will mean very little without proper investment in infrastructure. They won't even happen, such as roads, ports, rail and freight services, and as well as telecommunication technology, amongst many, many others. Now, the CFTA leadership, in conjunction with the heads of state and government, have, for instance, expressed plans to negotiate an African Development Fund geared towards building infrastructure. Additionally, the AU has indicated plans to upscale trade-related infrastructure as one of the program clusters in the action plan for boosting intra-African trade. So some work is being done. And this is not to mention the continued partnerships with third parties such as the EU and China. As we know, China has invested very heavily in the resource infrastructure exchange that it has had with the continent. The fifth challenge that we face as SMEs is a lack of a large market to test a company's goods and services. This is rather straightforward, but by opening up borders across the continent, the CFTA hopes to counter this difficulty head on by allowing small and medium-sized enterprises to test their products and services in a more receptive and applicable market across the region and perhaps the continent. As I mentioned earlier, the CFTA will open up a market of approximately 1.2 to 1.3 billion possible consumers. Now, aside from infrastructure, perhaps the other huge challenge that we face, and which has hamstrung a number of initiatives of this kind previously in the continent, is what we can probably all say together: the lack of political goodwill. Our politicians just don't do enough to support projects of this magnitude. This is especially important as the continent recovers from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been felt in Africa perhaps more than anywhere else, because the continent was already struggling. One of which is, for example, the increase in commodity prices due to the global economic shocks during and following the pandemic. Now, instead of being almost completely reliant on external value chains for basic products, African countries should implement the CFTA to strengthen resilience, provide options to withstand future economic shocks of this nature, and maintain sustainable growth in the post-COVID area. Now, those are some of the challenges that I've mentioned today, but there are many more. But with that being said, and hopefully this answers at least one of the questions that is likely to arise, history shows that the benefits to reduce trade tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade tend to be general. That is, increase in the size of the overall economy, reduction to a general price of goods or services across an economy, and can be difficult for political leadership to identify to a skeptical public. These are things, only economists will usually discuss. So telling it to a business owner in the streets of Nairobi will be a difficult task. But on the other hand, the cost to reduce the trade tariffs are typically localized and specific. So seen clearly when a city, for instance, loses a factory, or when trade disrupts individual livelihoods. So we might feel the costs more than we feel the benefits. So that's why it's a bit difficult for governments to sell such a project to its people. But there's no silver bullet to solve this issue. And each country's leaders should look to policies that further enhance the benefits of the CFTA while also being responsive to the costs. Now, the true condition for success of the implementation of the CFTA is the will of Africa's leaders to champion a policy that will require coordination, collaboration, and consensus building that responds effectively to likely social dislocations, which will happen. But the path forward is clear. African transformations are paving way for further continental integration, and the CFTA is a pillar of this progress. Now, what we hope to see less of is an Africa controlled by external interests, an extractivist continent. Rather, what we hope to see more of is a new dawn where the continent itself influences global trade by setting an example worth following, what I'd like to call an Africanization of international trade, if you will. Now, that is it for my hopefully brief and hopefully clear presentation. Mati, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. We call that an expert summary, right, from Ahmed. Now, just to pinpoint a few of the things that I've gathered from this, now for the Mwananchi summary. Basically, and feel free to correct me at any point when you feel like I've said something that's off. But from what you've said, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area / agreement came into effect in January this year, right?
January 2021. Actually.
2021, right?
Yeah.
So at the moment, we are actually, it's been signed, it's been ratified, everything is up and running. The offices are up in Ghana, right? There's already a secretariat. Yeah, there's already a secretariat for this. And essentially what the CFTA does is it hopes to open up borders for African countries so that trade can be intra-African, right? So we can all trade with each other. because we also have the economic blocks, right? The economic customs unions, the economic communities, such as EAC, COMESA, SADC, IGAD, all of the ones we were taught in GHC. All of those. This exactly. Is the time to remember them. So
you never thought they would come in handy until now.
Exactly. Yeah. So now basically what the CFTA, from what my understanding is that we hope now as African countries, we can trade amongst each other and also improve our specific and comprehensive economic situations, right?
Yeah.
And this represents an opportunity because from what I've seen from the African Union statistics, intra-African trade is actually less than 20%. So amongst Africans, we trade with each other the least. Of all the continents, of Europe, of Asia, of everything. So this represents an opportunity because it gives us an opportunity to trade with each other rather than accepting imports and rather exports from Europe and Asia and America and everything. Yeah, I can see Anthony saying the time for Africa is now. That's literally what this means. And for SMEs.
To add to what you said, Marty, is, the reason for this, is we're trying to drag ourselves from a colonial structure where these raw materials were extracted from Africa. So if you look at West Africa, for instance, we have a large cocoa farms, cacao farms, and where they're taken from the farm, taken to Switzerland and the Netherlands and Belgium, our former colonial masters, to be processed and then sold back to Africa as chocolates. So it really... It makes no sense. And we can't keep blaming the original sin of colonialism. We have to take our leaders to account and ensure that experts and professionals take advantage of an agreement of this nature.
Yeah. I mean, it's very encouraging to know, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Kenya was actually the second country to sign this agreement in 2018, right? After Ghana.
Yes.
So it shows that there's, at least on paper, a political goodwill for us to, go ahead and do this. And also the involvement of equity, just the same way you said, of providing funding to SMEs, shows that at least there's goodwill amongst our business and political community to actually see this through, right?
For sure.
Yeah. So I think based on that, we might have to move into the question segments. So some of you had already sent in a few questions prior to the webinar. So I'm going to try and tackle those as well as incorporate those that have come in from Rita, Anthony, everyone in the chat box. I'll just try and incorporate them so that we can kill two birds with one stone. Now, the first question that I saw, and it's very relevant to this conversation, is that given that many African countries rank low on the ease of doing business, does this imply that African nations will change their laws to make them more trade-friendly? What do you suppose, Ahmed?
The simple answer to that is yes, naturally. So what we have, the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, in itself is a national treaty governed by the normal laws of treaty. So the legal position is that we have many countries, such as Kenya. Kenya, for instance, the Kenyan Constitution provides that international treaties to which Kenya is a party, that Kenya has ratified, automatically form part of our laws, our domestic. So it is incumbent upon the government, the National Assembly, to develop legislation to ensure that those international treaties are properly implemented within the domestic legal structure. So that is what the CFTA intends to do. Continent join, become part and parcel of a country's laws, which then forces implementation and observance. So the simple answer to that is yes, African countries will have to incorporate the CFTA as part of their legal structure, their legal system, to ensure compliance. Now, the first part of that question was the fact that African countries rank low on the ease of doing business. Again, yes. And this is down to a myriad of issues, chief amongst which is what I mentioned earlier, the lack of infrastructure, extremely high tariffs, and our perennial issue of corruption. Yeah. So that is why we rank very low in ease of doing business. If you want to open a business in Kenya, we all know how hard it is as a foreign investor. whether you're coming in from Europe or China or other African countries, simply because many people want a cutback or things like this. So the ease of doing business is almost non-existent. So these are things that countries will have to tackle from within. But the CFTA does provide, which is something we'll get to later. The CFTA does provide measures that could be used to ensure that we make it easier to do business in Africa.
Yeah, just to support what you just said, most of our issues with doing business among African countries comes at the borders, right?
Yes.
And this is something that the CFTA hopes to tackle comprehensively. That's why there are so many meetings about what the agreements are, what the tariffs should be at the borders and everything. So thank you so much for answering that. Now it's you had also spoken about customs unions as well as the regional economic blocks, right? Such as EAC and COMESA, SADC, everything. So there's a question here that has come in that's asking if CFTA is being implemented, how does this then affect the existing economic blocks? What happens to them?
Again, I think this might have come out in my presentation, but what we need to understand is that CFTA does not phase out the regional economic communities that are there. These regional economic communities have already established trade lines, tariff concessions, a huge number of developmental, policies that the CFTA intends to take advantage of. It says so in the CFTA agreement itself that it will use the regional economic communities, the best practices of these regional economic communities as its building blocks. And it allows, under Article 19 of the CFTA agreement, it allows those regional economic communities, such as the EAC, which is already a customs union, that have achieved those levels of integration, so become customs union, for instance, to continue. And what we need to understand is the CFTA does not even stop countries from integrating further. So what we've seen recently, it's almost been happening concurrently with the implementation of the CFTA, has been the establishment of the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement, the TFTA. There's just so many acronyms in trade. But the TFTA, the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement, which brings together three of the continent's largest trade areas: the East African Community, SADC, which is the Southern African Development Community, and COMESA, which is perhaps the most successful trade area in the continent, into a conglomeration of approximately, I think it's 26 countries. So nearly half of the continent already is covered within this one trade agreement, which comes just under the CFTA in terms of its size. So the CFTA encourages, so the Secretariat and the Conference of Ministers encourage this sort of engagement, because it pushes us towards what the CFTA wants, which is an integrated market that opens up all borders, reduces tariffs, and ensures that African countries can trade and invest in each other. To end the confusion, will continue to survive, hopefully continue to thrive, but they need to understand that the AU's flagship project is now the CFTA. So even in negotiating with each other and externally, we need to remember the importance of putting the CFTA forward, the CFTA's agenda at the forefront.
Yeah, and also just to support what you said, I think I read somewhere that some of the members of the regional economic blocks or communities will get seats in an advisory capacity just to add in the CFTA. I think it's the Secretariat, we'll get some seats, and because they've been doing this for some time. So it's very good to get the advice, especially if we were going to integrate 54/55 countries into, what is going to be the largest trade area, basically, in the world.
Yeah, because what you're looking at is in other regions, for instance, there's only member states, and then for example, member states, and then the EU.
Yeah.
ASEAN and then the member states. But in Africa, you have the member states who are the primary members of the CFTA,
Yeah.
And then you have them as part of this, first level of regional economic communities, such as the EAC. And then you have above that the CFTA.
Yeah.
So it's a layered type of membership, which goes to my lasagna plate analogy. So you hope there's further levels of integration for sure, but it can be a bit of confusion in what regulations does the country follow when it comes to its obligations.
Right.
Yeah. So these are things that will hopefully be hashed out and clarified as we go along.
And speaking about the other regional economic blocks, there's a question about whether the CFTA favors the wealthier and more industrialized nations, right? There's a concern that they might flood their goods and services into the markets of less developed / less industrialized nations, killing the few industries in the less industrialized countries that can't compete. For example, and this goes straight into the SME conversation that we were having of countries like, for example, the North African countries or South Africa, who have who are essentially wealthier and more industrialized. Therefore, once you open up Africa to countries such as perhaps Zimbabwe or Burundi or such countries, the same examples that you were giving me. Isn't this a concern?
It's definitely a concern. It's a major concern. But then again, the CFTA has provided measures. So, pre-existing inequalities mean that, the more advanced countries, cities, manufacturing firms, and the African economic elite, as let's call them for the purpose of this discussion, could benefit the most from trade increase. That naturally. So countries like South Africa could benefit more. Countries like Nigeria could benefit more. But the CFTA, we need to know, has arguably the highest income disparities between its member countries than other continental free trade agreements. In other agreements, these countries are more closely comparable when it comes to their income, their GDP, and even their size. Together, for instance, for an example I'll give, together Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, 3 out of 54 countries, not even counting Kenya, account for about 50% of Africa's GDP.
Wow.
It's mad. So the African single market, brings together unequal economies with varying production capacities. It's something that's inevitable. But the agreement has attempted to put some measures. The CFTA agreement itself recognizes this as a major potential stumbling block. It's not necessarily a stumbling block, but it could be an issue towards implementation. Such as one, delaying full trade liberalization. The agreement didn't come in and say, from tomorrow, we've liberalized all trade. You need to give your tariff concessions, and we need to open all borders immediately. No. It's a phased process, in place and the phased process is there to protect Africa's less developed economies, which is a large number of these countries. Also free movement of people, for instance, under the agreement, and companies will allow those marginalized by import exposure to hopefully move to more favorable areas. But most importantly, Articles 3, 4, and 5 of the 9th Annex to the CFTA agreement, which perhaps those concerned could have a look at, which covers trade remedies, is relevant. The articles discuss safeguard measures, which may be applied as a response to an influx of goods from other member states that damage the domestic industry. So when a country feels that a larger country with a bigger economy is flooding its market with imported goods, that's going to be damaging to domestic industry, there are preferential trade measures that respond to this exact scenario. But that would, a country is allowed then to insulate its market, its economy, by saying, stop. We are not going to accept any more imports, which is something that goes against what the CFTA says. The CFTA says open your borders. But when you feel like the goods are being imported at a level that will damage your economy, then you're allowed to put in place protectionist measures as an exception to the market access policies that are in place. But research has also shown, it's important to note, that development, even for the least developed, is certain. Even for the smallest countries, in a trade agreement such as this, if properly implemented, some level of development is certain. The bigger risk in Africa, in my opinion, is dealing with the selfishness and greed of an already, insatiable political elite, rather than the consequences of market competition, because this will be healthy competition that will push businesses to the next level, and hopefully the member states themselves. So we should be. Well, it's not to suggest that we shouldn't be worried, but there are measures in place to help these countries, for sure.
Does this also apply to, and I know you've touched on it a bit, in terms of like movement of people, because there's a concern as you've seen, Africans also moving into Europe, right? And once you open the African borders, right, there might be the temptation, or rather the effect of also people from less developed African countries going into more developed / industrial. I do not like using those terms, but just for the sake of this conversation, because apparently now we have to segment African countries also into these same groupings. But just for the sake of this conversation, do you think that will be a concern as well?
I look at it more as an opportunity, Marty. For instance, you know how hard it is to travel from Kenya to Nigeria, from Kenya to South Africa. We still need visas. It's insane, Yeah. It's the fact that potentially a Kenyan from Nakuru might want to travel to Lagos to do business because they feel that they might be more successful there is now impossible, almost impossible. So opening up the market by, countries giving concessions in terms of visa-free travel, for instance, is what is really, really needed. We haven't seen that in Africa. So we can't even make the argument that Kenyans, people in less developed countries will move to more developed nations. This is naturally going to happen. It's happening with devolution in Kenya, for instance, it's still happening with devolution. But with devolution, we're seeing development of more remote counties, allowing people to move back. And that's what we're hoping the CFTA will try to do. Build industries in across the continent, allowing a free flow of movement of people, ideas, technical knowledge, because you might find, an expert engineer living in Namibia whose expertise is more relevant and applicable and needed in northern Kenya or southern Ethiopia.
Yeah.
And now for that engineer, even if he comes across an opportunity or she comes across an opportunity online, the hurdles that they have to go through to establish their business in these countries, dissuade them from traveling. So I think we should look at it more as an opportunity for exchange of ideas, free flow of movement, and businesses to be able to operate cross-border. Yeah, rather than as a possible impediment.
Yeah, I think as Africans, sometimes we're tempted to look at the negative side rather than the positive side. So thanks a lot for that refreshing perspective.
Again, imagine traveling from, let's say, Kenya to Morocco.
Yeah.
It's almost as if you're going to a totally different continent. We forget, for instance, that these North African countries are, part and parcel of the AU. And traveling to them, obtaining a visa as a Kenyan passport holder is just as hard as me obtaining a visa to go to the States, in the United States. It makes no sense. We are part and parcel of the same continent. Transfer and movement of people should be at the forefront of the CFTA.
And speaking about the States and such things, of course, when you're talking about uniting a whole continent, most conversation can turn into, what about a common currency? The EU has the euro, and such, that symbolizes kind of the strength of the economic community, right? So there was a question about whether now, once we open up the borders and Africans are trading with each other, are we just going to make the dollar, stronger? Are we going to make external currencies stronger? What in your perspective, what does the unification of currency, what role does that play in this?
It's a very good question. Probably better answered by a financial economist, but I'll give it a good
okay.
shot. It's a question that obviously arises. Gaddafi, for instance, his ultimate dream coincided with Kwame Nkrumah's having a common African currency, united under a single political union with essentially the United States of Africa, within which the dream is to have a common currency. And that is what we are looking at in that statement is Africa, the CFTA in its final form, where we are a fully integrated economic and political union, where we have one currency. That won't happen tomorrow or in the next, probably not even in our lifetime, but it's something that is looked to possibly happening at the end of the implementation process. But currently, countries like members of the ASEAN, the Association of Southeastern Asian States, do not have a common currency. The ASEAN is one of the most successful regional trade agreements in the world. We peg success on the EU as an economic union. The EU has been extremely successful for sure, but the circumstances of the implementation are very different. These are countries that are very similar, even coming out of World War II. So but we have the flip side, which is ASEAN. It's working without a common currency, but. So this is why I think comparing it directly to the EU, which has a common currency, is a bit of a misnomer. It's not something. But currently, we do have. I should mention the franc, which is the CFA franc, which is in use across large parts of West Africa. I think it's 8 or 9 countries in West Africa have the franc, but. This is not to forget that the franc is a colonial relic.
Yeah,
it's pegged on the euro. It's a colonial relic, and it's not ideal. It's what we're trying to phase out. Yeah. But again, in the 2019 summit, for instance, with French President Emmanuel Macron, the Ivory Coast President, Côte d'Ivoire President Alassane Ouattara, he announced that the franc would be replaced by the ECO, which is the new currency that hopes to bring together West Africa in a post-colonial system of currency system. Again, the ECO, which is now being phased in, will be pegged on the euro, which is still probably problematic, but these are steps in the right direction.
Yeah.
So again, like exactly, building blocks, as the CFTA likes to call them. So we might like a common currency, but they're bigger, more important issues to address.
Okay. Yeah. And just closely related to the currency is an issue at the heart of SMEs, especially when we're talking about opening up the continent and the prevalence of e-commerce. If something is being sold in Nigeria, we can actually see it in Kenya, we can order for it and such kinds of things. There's the issue of payment, right? Like cross-border payments. Especially to strengthen the e-commerce among the specific African countries. Do you have any idea about whether the CFTA touches on this?
Yeah, so that actually it's a good question. Thank you for reminding me. The question is why is cross-border payment in Africa so expensive?
Yeah,
and how does this, how does the CFTA address it? To address this exact issue, we have what is called the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which is a cross-border financial market infrastructure system that's been created to enable payment transactions across the continent. It works in collaboration with Africa's main central banks to provide a payment and settlement service to which commercial banks then payment service providers and fintechs across the region can connect as participants. It provides an instant payment system where participants no longer need to convert their local currency to the dollar or the euro into hard currencies, which you almost always causes delays, and you lose money when you convert. When you convert that way from an African currency to European, these peg things like the dollar or the euro. And it just makes things faster. Instead of converting them into hard currencies, which then entailed the funds leaving Africa to be converted, what happens now is this is done within the continent. And it's very quick. Compliance, legal and sanction checks are performed instantly within the system, and near instant payments. I mean, they're processed, to be honest, within around 120 seconds. So I would advise that we all look at the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which is one of the means by which the CFTA is to be implemented.
I'm glad you repeated it again. I found myself trying to figure out what that was. You said Pan-African Payment and Settlement System.
Yeah, PAPS.
PAPS.
Yeah.
Okay. PAPS. Yeah. Definitely something for SME owners to check out. And just on that same topic of borders, we got in a question from someone who owns a logistics business. Let me actually read the exact question was. I own a logistics company, and every day we see how difficult it is to do business in a continent with very poor infrastructure, with some countries lacking even basic infrastructure. Do they have a plan to address the continent's infrastructure problem?
That honestly, to me personally, is the biggest hurdle to implementing the CFTA, because the CFTA is, a continental guideline for countries to implement locally. So the CFTA cannot build a road. You cannot build a road through the CFTA, but through the action plan for boosting intra-African trade, which came following the CFTA, the African leadership, together with the heads of state and the African Development Bank and AfRexim Bank as well, they've come up with a fund, the African Development Fund, they're calling it, which is there to build infrastructure. And, it's also indicated plans to upskill trade-related infrastructure. So things like telecommunication services and other, more tangible, infrastructure projects through the BIAT. So countries will have to invest significantly in development of these infrastructural systems and structures. It doesn't make sense to come up with all these really nice ideas and we don't have by which to implement them. Yeah, but the CFTA is doing its part. If you look at, again, I would advise that, we all look at the action plan for boosting intra-African trade, the BIAT, the action plan, and it sets out more in more clarity than I can within this webinar, to the means by which the CFTA intends to address these issues. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for covering that. I think those are so many things that we need to reflect on, and thank you a lot for all that information. Really appreciate it, especially because, and also for the audience who had sent their questions beforehand. Thanks a lot. You enabled us to have a more fruitful discussion, considering the things that you actually wanted us to tackle. So thanks a lot for that. These were all the pre-sent questions. So I think right now I'll move into, I think we have about 7 minutes. We'll just do a few of the chat questions that we have here. I see Abdishakur has a good question here. Africa is a huge market for second-hand goods. How does the CFTA handle this challenge, as it is more promoting trade made in Africa? Does it even matter as long as we are trading with each other and not creating value by producing ourselves? So I think essentially it's, second-hand markets, mitumbas and such like, right? Flood our African markets. So, how does the CFTA at least foresee this as a challenge, and also just promoting African-made stuff? And I know you had touched on this earlier, so I just appreciate just a short summary on how you think we can handle that.
Primarily, what we need to do in Africa is develop. In Kenya, for instance, we need to develop or reintroduce our textile industry. So a lot of this will happen through development of local regional value chains. The problem is in Africa, we have all the raw materials, the capability to process and manufacture cross-border. So Kenya can have, for instance, the raw materials necessary for a thriving textile industry. whereas Namibia might have the industrial capability to turn these into market-ready clothes. So we need to develop, for instance, through the tripartite free trade agreement in conjunction with SADC and the EAC, a regional value chain that allows these countries to leverage their comparative advantage. You produce, you bring us the raw materials, we'll manufacture together within this regional value chain, produce give you a final product that can be sold across the continent. The threat of second-hand products is always going to be there, simply because it's just a cheaper option. But hopefully it can be phased out with development of these regional value chains. So my research is, how these regional value chains can help implement CFTA, and this is one of the ways.
Right. And just a bit related to that, I see a question from Team Vengi, who says, "Hi, Jelle, don't you feel that the CFTA could have succeeded better by working through business groupings and private sector associations like KEPSA or Kenya Association of Manufacturers in Kenya's case, instead of political leaders, then use these groups to put the agenda of the CFTA?" I guess that's touching directly to, why do we need political goodwill instead of acting with private sector actors who are already sold into the concept?
So if you look at, we can't work without the political group, because they create legislation to allow the CFTA to be implemented domestically. It just has to happen. But it's not to suggest that they're the ones running the initiative. This initiative will be run by the private sector. This is why the CFTA Secretariat is not only approaching governments through their ministerial conference, but also entering into MOUs with large private sector players such as Trademark East Africa, Equity, and other Stanbic, other institutions. So organizations like KEPSA, CAM will definitely have a huge role to play in implementation of the CFTA. But if we don't have any support or goodwill by the political elite, because for example, the rules of origin that govern the cross-border movement of products, legislative enactments that are done in the respective national assemblies by these politicians. So we need to make sure that these rules, but these rules are put in place through discussions, public participation of these private sector players. So naturally, like any government initiative, international initiative, the private sector will have a crucial role to play, for sure. So yeah, Tim, I think?
Yeah, Team Mudengi. I don't know if the T is for Tim or, we said a lot of T's today.
Yeah, Team Mudengi. I think, probably as a member of the private sector, you do have a strong role.
Yeah. I think Anthony posed so many questions, but I think you've covered most of them. Thanks, Anthony, for the extensive interaction. But I do believe that Ahmed has made a great attempt at answering all of them, and as well as our other considerations. I think we've been able to cover everything, and we've done it within the required time. I think they say African time, but I think we've tried today.
We've tried. We've tried.
Done a great job. So thanks a lot, Ahmed. You have really enlightened us on all this. Now at least I know a bit about all this stuff, and if I walk into a room, people can be like, and thanks a lot for your time. Koba is really happy to have hosted you, and just in respect of people's time, I think I'll just have to thank the audience, everyone, for tuning in. I hope this has been an informative session for all of you, because it definitely has been for me. I hope we've learned a thing or two about what the Africa CFTA intends to do. And for the small, medium enterprise owners, I hope that this was insightful and that you are able to now prepare, so that when this takes full effect and when all the red tape has been cut down, we're ready to handle our business. So thanks for tuning in. You can follow Koba on Koba Africa. You can follow me on @MaterialMan on Instagram, and Ahmed Yasin _ on Instagram. I made sure the underscore has to be.
The underscore.
Thanks everyone for your time, and in respect of your time, I will close this off.
Yeah, much appreciated. Thank you so much.